this even exist? And the answer to this is pretty actually complex. Well, believe it or not, it's probably, but not certainly. And it's definitely not. What do we know? Well, we absolutely know that Christianity existed, and it started sometime around the reign of Tiberius. Actually, no, wait. It's attested to in Tacitus's Annals, which is not one of my favorites, but it's actually pretty good. Christus, from whom the name had origin, talking about Christians, suffered extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, which means governor, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So, we know that, at least from a very well-respected historian, this occurred. Now, was Jesus the Christ, as we Christians believe, or a prophet, as the Muslims believe, or just some guy, as most other people believe? Well, that's up for question, because these two guys, who are our best sources on the time period, as well as several others which are also well regarded, don't actually give Jesus's name, that is Yeshua, the son of Yosef, of the house of Dawood. So maybe is the answer to that. But there was definitely someone who was considered a Messiah, or an anointed one, which is what Christos means. So, and we definitely know that Christians were persecuted. Same two sources discussing Nero. This is Suetonius, Gaius Suetonius Tranquillus, and the 12 Caesars, which is just a great read, by the way. He likewise inflicted punishments on the Christians, a sort of people who held a new and impious superstition. He previously had said about Tiberius Claudius Drusus Caesar, he banished from Rome all the Jews who were continually making disturbances at the instigation of one Chrestus. So, again, evidence that Christians existed and that they were a thorn in the imperial side is definitely the case. Now we enter into the realm of, so Christianity existed during that time. And that's good to know, because, hey, at least we know they existed. And of course there was a source for Christianity, an originator, a leader. Who it was, we really can't say. But there's really no reason to doubt that at least a lot of the historic stuff in the Gospels is false. The Catholic Study Bibles and the Oxford's various versions, and some of the better study versions of the New International Version Bible, all discuss the historic context in great detail. I highly recommend them all. Personally, I think the most recent Catholic Study Bible is one of the better translations, although it's much less poetic than most of the others, because it's trying its best for accuracy and not posy. So, if you want pretty words, go to the King James Bible. If you want something that actually is in any way, shape, or form similar to what was written way back when, then, go with the New American Standard Catholic Bible, the Revised Edition, or the Oxford one was also very good in that regard. And they put a lot of stuff into context about these sorts of things, and that's context is extremely important. Eye of a needle, for example, refers to a pedestrian gate. In Jerusalem, it doesn't refer to a literal, needle like this. So, that's a good example. There are many, many more in any text that's, more than a few hundred years, or actually even 100 odd years. You want to have context in order to understand it, and the farther back you go, the more important that context is. So, what do we know about Jesus that is likely true? Well, first off, he was very likely, he was of Semitic origin, which at the time meant darker skin, more similar in looking to Arabs, although not exactly by any stretch, or modern day Egyptians, then, the Nordic prince of later years. We know that, as was the fashion at the time, he was portrayed, believe it or not, with short hair and no facial hair. And the reason why we know this is because there were repurposed statues of Apollo, which had that configuration that were used in place of Jesus, and that lasted actually until the iconoclasts, which is a whole other topic. Now, of course, since Jesus was Jewish, he very well may have had the hair of someone who's both facial and head hair of someone who is Hasidic. We don't know whether or not style overrode religious religious strictures with regards to hair, and so we maybe he could have been short-haired with a beard or long-haired with no facial. We don't know, and we know that he was born roughly around 7 BC ish, and died in the 30s, maybe 20s or 30s. We know that there were many, 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 many similar faiths at that time, and let's just be honest, they were cults, because most of them were small, which is one of the requirements for a cult in certain definitions, and most of them were led by a charismatic leader, again, like Jesus, and most of them were what we call mystery cults. Mystery cults is a technical term referring to belief systems where the doctrine is hidden from the rest of society. Modern religions are absolutely not mystery cults. If anything, it's hard to get people to stop talking about what they believe. You can go and find for, basically cost copies of the Quran, numerous Bibles, the Torah, Tanakh, and the commentaries, the Bhagavad Gita, the writings of Buddha, the Tao Te Ching, and so on, for pretty much close to free or at cost. So none of those are mystery cults. But there were many, many, many more the farther back you go. It was much more common for a religion to be a mystery cult. Even mainstream ones, like the worship of Vesta in Rome, were mystery cults, even though they were literally part of the state in the case of the Vestal Virgins. So, that wasn't the case with Christianity, or what became Christianity, which was called the Way at the time. And the reason why we know this is because there are documents, which were basically letters that spread around, that that spread the faith around. These aren't really referenced elsewhere, but literary scholarship and historical scholarship has shown that these things probably existed with like a 90+% probability. And there was also, of course, all sorts of letters that were written from Paul and Peter and John and so on that we know of, okay, and that are some of the earliest documents, and they date from either Nero or before, so pretty early on. Christianity definitely predates Roman Mithraism, which was a very popular mystery cult and probably the closest thing to an actual competitor Christianity ever had, as the Greco-Roman belief system was starting to die out, and in many cases had died out and was replaced by Eastern mysticism, which Christianity was considered part of. A lot of these cults, like the Zealots, were much more radical than Christians, contrary to what Reza Aslan, who is a scholar who has good research, and I'm not going to go on any further about his conclusions. As Reza Aslan asserted that Jesus was a zealot and that he was poor, neither of which things are true. We know neither of those things are true. Judas was, in fact, a zealot and a Christian, which was a weird combination. And that's one of the things which may have contributed to the betrayal portrayed in the Bible, assuming that actually happened. This is most of the historic stuff in the Bible, like the crucifixion and other things like this, probably happened. There's a very good chance they did. For one thing, Pontius Pilate was recorded in other places, non-Christian sources, like these two, and many others, as being a complete dick. And the sort of guy who would do anything to enrich himself, and also the same sort of guy who was very brutal, frankly. So crucifying someone because he felt like it was definitely something he would do. So if you had some guy who people said was being a political agitator, first off, there's a really good chance he'd be either exiled or killed just for that, okay? Whether or not he actually was a political agitator, being perceived as a political agitator would have been sufficient. Rome had gone through several hundred years of various people being killed and their estates seized in order to suppress political dissent. It starts with the Gracchi brothers and continues on, and will continue on basically throughout some of the Byzantine area into the modern era, like around the 1400s, well, Renaissance, so about 1400s. So that's definitely possible. I mean, if anything, being known as a political agitator is sufficient for crucifixion, okay? Especially for a non-citizen, which Jesus was. So that's probably happened not just to Jesus, but many others as well, because again, you couldn't throw a rock without hitting someone who was proclaiming themselves the Messiah throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. You had Neoplatonists, you had, which later joined with Judaism to make Christianity. You had so many different Jewish belief systems being spawned. You had the Sibyllines, who were officially recognized mystery cult, but also had different agitators. You had Zoroastrians coming in from Persia, and a bunch of Magi declaring themselves to be all sorts of things. You had gurus coming in from India, and yogis would eventually arise and come in from India as well. I mean, there was just a whole host of things in the Eastern Mediterranean. It was a religiously active time. So, fundamentally, to answer those questions, okay, but let's go back for a second. So, someone like Jesus, maybe not Jesus exactly, but someone very much like Jesus definitely existed. Otherwise, we wouldn't have Christianity. Otherwise, you wouldn't have attestations in books like these. Okay, so we know that's true. Now, whether or not Jesus was Jesus or taught specifically the things he taught is up for grabs. However, a lot of what Jesus taught was at the time contemporary Neoplatonist thought, which is one of the main influencers of Christianity, thanks to John and others, the Apostle John, and others, and Paul as well. It was also very in line with contemporary Hellenic Judaism, seen it with Rabbi Hillel, who was one of the greats, and frankly, I think that he's the dividing line really between the BC 80 thing should really be at Hillel, but that's a different story altogether, because he was, if anything, more influential because he influenced Jesus and numerous other groups. So if you combine Hillel plus Neoplatonism, you get Christianity. As if you combine those two with local belief systems and traditions and ethnic practices, you get modern Christianity. So, so clearly someone preaching what was current thought patterns at the time was extremely likely. Someone who developed a following along those lines was extremely likely. Being viewed as a political agitator, as Christians and any monotheists were, and whether or not Christianity is truly monotheistic is a whole another concept, but that's extremely likely. So the entire thing points to that if Jesus didn't exist, someone exactly like Jesus existed. Okay? There's an old thing in literary analysis, because there's an occasional debate of whether or not Shakespeare wrote the plays we attribute to Shakespeare, and there's a saying, Shakespeare may not have written Shakespeare, but Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare. Same thing. Jesus may not have been Jesus, but Jesus definitely was Jesus. So he may not have had that name or anything like this, but there's somebody like that. And that's where I get the probably. So, what does this mean culturally for us? Well, first off, since you might as well call this guy Jesus, calling him Jesus. The existence of Jesus as Messiah or prophet, or just some guy who told people to be nice, is a matter of faith, regardless of how you look at it, because we weren't there. We don't have any people writing at that exact moment. We have people writing shortly afterwards, but we don't have people writing at that moment, so we don't know. But the difference between not Jesus and Jesus is so minimal that it's pointless to really get into it. I mean, if you want to say that Jesus didn't exist, but someone like Jesus did exist, that's fine. That's potentially accurate. If you want to say Jesus definitely existed, that's fine. It's also potentially accurate. My belief on the matter is irrelevant, but I personally believe that from a faith standpoint, Jesus existed, and from a historical analysis standpoint, Jesus probably existed. In more, at least as much as any other religious leader we've encountered throughout history, because a lot of them are completely unknown. Zoroaster, as I mentioned, Zoroastrianism before, we know almost nothing about Zoroaster. So Jesus is a lot better attested than Zoroaster, and a lot better attested than Romulus and Remus, or any number of other people which we assume existed. So, I mean, there's more evidence for Jesus than there is for me. So, since I think I exist, I'm more sure that Jesus exists. That's how I feel. So, fundamentally, the answer is probably, but it doesn't really make a difference. So, I hope that was interesting for you guys. Take care. And I'll see if this thing goes off. By the way, if anybody knows how to make Twitch videos appear in their proper aspect ratio, please tell me.